My brother and wife kicked me out of our family business. Dad's secret letter.
They handed me 2 sets of papers on the same Tuesday morning. Divorce papers from my wife of 15 years. Business exit documents from my brother who I'd built everything with. Sign here, Jeff, and here. Just like that, 20 years of my life reduced to signatures on legal documents. My name is Jeff Morrison, 45 years old, and until that Tuesday, I was co-owner of Morrison Construction, the company my father started in our garage 30 years ago. The company my brother David and I had grown from 3 employees to over 200, the company that was supposed to be our legacy. But legacies have a way of crumbling when the people you trust most decide you're standing in their way. I should have seen it coming. The signs were all there if I'd been paying attention instead of focusing on quarterly reports and job site inspections. Sarah, working late at the office more often, even though she was just our marketing director. David, suddenly interested in the financial side of things, asking questions about ownership structures and profit sharing. The way they'd stop talking when I walked into a room. The late-night phone calls Sarah claimed were from clients, but when I'd answer the office phone the next day, those same clients would act like they hadn't spoken to anyone recently. David's sudden interest in taking over the company's insurance policies and banking relationships, things he'd never cared about before. The way Sarah started dressing differently for work, buying expensive clothes we couldn't afford on her salary. But you know what they say about hindsight, Murd. What I didn't realize was how long they'd been planning this. Later, I'd discover they'd been meeting secretly for months, not just as lovers, but as conspirators. Sarah had been documenting everything, my work habits, my client relationships, even my personal weaknesses. David had been quietly building relationships with our biggest clients, positioning himself as the real leader of the company. They'd turned my dedication to the work against me. While I was on job sites making sure projects were completed on time and under budget, they were in boardrooms and at client dinners, slowly convincing everyone that the company would run better without me. The meeting was in our conference room, the one with the picture of Dad breaking ground on our first major project. David sat at the head of the table like he already owned the place. Sarah wouldn't even look at me directly. "This is the cleanest way to handle things," David said, sliding the papers across the mahogany table Dad had bought to celebrate our first $1 million year. No lawyers, no court battles, just a fair division of assets. Fair, that's the word he used. As I looked at those papers, I remembered when David and I first joined Dad in the business. We were 23 and 25, fresh out of college, eager to prove ourselves. Dad had sat us down at this same table and explained his vision. "This isn't just about making money," he'd said. "It's about building something that lasts, something we can pass down. The Morrison name means something in this town. It means quality, integrity, and keeping your word. Never forget that." David had nodded enthusiastically that day. We both had. We thought we understood what Dad meant. But somewhere along the way, David had forgotten that the Morrison name wasn't just about profit margins and market share. I read through both sets of documents. The divorce papers were standard enough. 50-50 split of personal assets, though somehow Sarah was keeping the house we'd renovated together room by room. The house where we'd planned to raise kids, where we'd hosted company barbecues every summer, where I'd spent countless weekends fixing everything from leaky faucets to loose shingles. The business documents were more complex. My 49% ownership would transfer to David for what the papers called fair market value. He'd become majority owner overnight. But as I read through the financial projections they'd used to calculate that value, I noticed something interesting. They'd significantly undervalued the company's assets, particularly our equipment and real estate holdings. "What about the original partnership agreement?" I asked. "Dad set up specific terms when he gave us the company." David shrugged. "Times change, Jeff. The business needs clear leadership. Can't have 2 captains on one ship." The irony wasn't lost on me. I was the one who'd handled operations while David focused on sales. I was the one who knew every foreman by name, every supplier's phone number by heart. I was the one who worked weekends and holidays to keep projects on schedule. I was the one who'd personally guaranteed the loans that had funded our expansion into commercial construction. But I was also the one who'd apparently been too blind to see what was happening right under my nose. "The clients prefer working with David anyway," Sarah added, finally speaking up. "He's better with people." That stung, because it wasn't entirely untrue. David had always been the charmer, the one who could sell ice to Eskimos, as Dad used to say. But charm doesn't dig foundations or wire buildings or manage crews of skilled tradesmen who respect experience over smooth talk. "Where will you go?" Sarah asked as I gathered the signed papers. First words she'd spoken directly to me all morning. "Away," I said. That was it. No anger, no accusations, no begging for explanations, just acceptance of a reality I couldn't change. What I wanted to say was, how could you do this to us? How could you throw away 15 years of marriage for my brother? How could you both destroy what Dad built? But what was the point? They'd already made their choice. I walked out of that conference room, through the office where I'd spent the last 15 years, past the pictures on the walls showing projects we'd completed, awards we'd won, the company Christmas parties where we'd all smiled and pretended to be one big happy family. The photos told the story of Morrison Construction's growth. There was Dad with his first crew in 1985, David and me joining the company in 1995, our first $1 million project in 2001, the expansion into commercial work in 2008, Sarah joining as marketing director in 2012, when we finally got big enough to need dedicated marketing. Looking at those photos, I could see the exact moment when things started to change. It was subtle at first, the way Sarah and David stood just a little closer together in group shots, the way they both started looking at the camera with the same confident expression, the way I gradually moved from the center of the photos to the edge. I didn't take anything from my office. What was the point? Everything in there was part of a life that no longer belonged to me. My office had been my sanctuary for 15 years. The walls were covered with blueprints from my favorite projects, the library renovation that had won a state architecture award, the affordable housing complex that had provided homes for 50 families, the emergency repairs we'd done after the tornado in 2018. My desk drawer held 20 years of business cards from suppliers, subcontractors, and clients who trusted Morrison Construction because they trusted me. But none of that mattered now. You know what surprised me most? I wasn't angry. Not yet. I felt empty. Like someone had reached into my chest and removed something essential, leaving just a hollow space where my purpose used to be. I drove for 3 hours before I realized I was heading toward the old family cabin upstate. Dad had left it to both David and me, but we'd never bothered to update the paperwork. Technically, it belonged to both of us equally, but David was probably too busy celebrating to remember that particular detail. The drive gave me time to think about how we'd gotten here. When had David stopped being my brother and become my competitor? When had Sarah stopped being my wife and started being his ally? When had the family business stopped being about family? I remembered the last real conversation I'd had with Dad before he died. We were sitting on this same cabin's porch, watching the sunset over the lake. He'd been talking about retirement, about gradually turning more responsibility over to David and me. The hardest part about building something, he'd said, isn't the building. It's making sure it survives after you're gone. Money can't buy loyalty, Jeff, and success doesn't guarantee character. At the time, I thought he was just being philosophical. Now I wondered if he'd already seen something in David that I'd missed. The cabin hadn't been used in years. Dad used to take us there when we were kids, before the business got big enough to consume every weekend. He'd teach us to fish, to split wood, to understand that there's satisfaction in work done with your own hands. A man's character shows in how he handles defeat, he used to say. Anyone can be gracious when they're winning. The cabin was exactly as we'd left it after Dad's funeral 3 years ago. Dust sheets covered the furniture, spider webs decorated the corners, and the air smelled like old wood and forgotten memories. But it was still solid, still standing, still the refuge Dad had built with his own hands 40 years ago. I spent that first night sitting on the porch, drinking Dad's old whiskey from the bottle he'd left in the kitchen cabinet. The silence was complete up there. No traffic, no construction noise, no phone calls about delayed deliveries or permit issues. Just the sound of wind through pine trees and my own thoughts spinning in circles. That's when I started to get angry. Not the hot, explosive kind of anger that makes you throw things or punch walls. The cold, calculating kind that settles in your bones and starts making plans. They thought they'd won. David was probably already planning changes to the company structure, maybe bringing in Sarah as a full partner now that I was out of the picture. They'd divided my life between them, like they were carving up a Thanksgiving turkey. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They assumed I'd just disappear quietly, lick my wounds and start over somewhere else. They assumed I didn't have any cards left to play. As I sat there in the darkness, I started remembering things. Conversations with Dad that hadn't made sense at the time. His insistence on keeping certain documents at the cabin instead of in the office safe. The way he'd sometimes ask cryptic questions about family loyalty and business partnerships. "Promise me something, Jeff," he'd said during one of our last conversations. "If the family ever falls apart, remember that blood doesn't always determine who your real family is. Sometimes the people who betray you show you who was really on your side all along." But first, I called our longtime foreman, Mike Rodriguez, the man who'd been with the company for 22 years. "Jeff?" Mike sounded surprised to hear from me. "I heard about what happened." "What are you hearing, Mike?" There was a pause. "David called a meeting yesterday, said there would be some changes in management structure, said you'd decided to pursue other opportunities." "That's one way to put it. How are the guys taking it?" Another pause. "Honestly, they're worried. A lot of these guys have been with the company for 10, 15 years. They know you, they trust you. David's always been more of a salesman than a construction guy." "I know. Take care of them, Mike. Whatever happens, look out for the crew." "Jeff, what's really going on? This doesn't feel right." I almost told him everything then, but I wasn't ready. Not yet. "Just keep your eyes open, Mike. Things might not be as settled as they seem." Dad's study was exactly as he'd left it. Books on construction techniques and business management lined the shelves. His old drafting table still had blueprints spread across it from a project he'd been working on before the heart attack took him. His desk was covered with the controlled chaos of a man who knew where everything was, even if nobody else did. I started with the file cabinets, sorting through decades of business documents, tax returns, and correspondence. Dad had been meticulous about keeping records. Maybe too meticulous. Some of this stuff went back to when the company was just him and 2 part-time helpers. Among the papers, I found things I'd forgotten about. The original incorporation documents from 1985. Insurance policies from the early days when Dad was personally liable for everything. Contracts with our first major client, handwritten and signed at this very desk. But I also found things I'd never seen before. Legal correspondence about business structures and succession planning. Notes in Dad's handwriting about protecting the company's future and ensuring family stability. References to meetings with lawyers I'd never met. That's when I found the safe. It was built into the wall behind a false panel that I only discovered when I was moving the heavy filing cabinet. A small combination safe, the kind you'd use for important documents and maybe some emergency cash. I stared at that safe for a long time, trying to remember if Dad had ever mentioned it. He'd always been secretive about certain aspects of the business, especially the legal and financial side. "That's for me to worry about," he'd say, whenever David or I asked too many questions. The combination came to me like a flash of memory. Dad's birthday, followed by the year he started the company. The same numbers he used for everything important. The safe opened with a soft click. Inside were 3 things: a small stack of cash, maybe $5,000, Dad's original will, which I'd thought was lost, and a sealed envelope with my name on it in Dad's careful handwriting. Below my name in smaller letters, "Open if divided." My hands were shaking as I tore open the envelope. 2 documents fell out. The first was a letter in Dad's handwriting. The second was a legal document I didn't immediately recognize. The letter was dated 6 months before Dad died. "Jeff," it began, "if you're reading this, it means the worst has happened. Not my death. I've made my peace with that. But the family splitting apart. I saw the signs before I passed, and I hoped I was wrong. David's ambition. Sarah's restlessness. The way you threw yourself into work instead of protecting what mattered most." I had to stop reading for a moment. Dad had known. Somehow he'd seen what was coming before any of us did. The letter continued. "I built this company for family, not profit. When I gave you and David equal shares, I thought that would keep you together. I was naive. Equal shares in a family business is like giving two children one toy. Eventually, they'll fight over who gets to keep it. I've watched both my sons grow into men, and I've seen your different characters emerge. David has the gift of charm and ambition. He can sell anything to anyone, and he genuinely believes he's helping people when he does it. But he sees the business as a means to an end, a way to build wealth and status. You, Jeff, see the business differently. You understand that Morrison Construction isn't just about making money. It's about building things that last, maintaining relationships based on trust, treating our employees like family. You understand that our reputation is worth more than our profit margin. The document with this letter is my insurance policy, a codicil to my will that I never filed with the lawyers. It transfers an additional 25% of company ownership to you, Jeff, to be activated only if the family partnership dissolves. You won't just have equal shares, you'll have controlling interest. I stopped reading and grabbed the second document. It was exactly what Dad described. A legal codicil, properly notarized and witnessed, that would give me 74% ownership of Morrison Construction. The letter wasn't finished. I know this seems unfair to David, but fairness isn't always equal. You're the one who understands what this company really is. Not just a way to make money, but a way to build something that lasts. David sees opportunity. You see responsibility. That's why the company should be yours if push comes to shove. I've been watching the warning signs for months. David's increasingly aggressive approach to expansion. Sarah's growing influence over business decisions she doesn't fully understand. The way both of them have started treating the company like their personal property rather than a family legacy. I've also been watching you throw yourself deeper into work, avoiding the problems at home and in the family. That's not the answer, Jeff. But if you're reading this letter, it means those problems have already solved themselves in the worst possible way. The codicil is valid and legal. I had it prepared by a lawyer in Syracuse that neither you nor David knows about. All you have to do is file it with the county clerk and notify the company's board of directors. But Jeff, and this is important, only use this if you're absolutely certain the family can't be saved. Once you activate this, there's no going back. I love you both. But if you're reading this, one of you has already made the choice for me. Your father, Robert Morrison. P.S. Check the desk drawer, there's something else you'll need. I sat in Dad's chair for 2 hours, reading and rereading that letter, studying the codicil, trying to process what it meant. Then I remembered the postscript and opened the desk drawer. Inside was a manila folder labeled David and Sarah Evidence. My blood went cold as I opened it. The folder contained photographs, documents, and what appeared to be a private investigator's report. Dad had known about the affair for at least 8 months before he died. There were photos of David and Sarah at restaurants, hotels, even at business conferences where they'd shared rooms while telling everyone they were in separate accommodations. But it wasn't just about the affair. The investigator had documented financial irregularities, company credit cards used for personal expenses, client entertainment that didn't match any actual client meetings, even evidence that they'd been sharing confidential company information with our competitors. Dad had known everything, and he'd done nothing except prepare for the inevitable. David thought he'd maneuvered me out of the company. Sarah thought she'd traded up to a better life. They both thought they'd won. But Dad had seen them coming from 3 years away. I drove back to town that afternoon, not to confront anyone or cause a scene, but to talk to a lawyer. Not our usual corporate attorney. David would hear about that immediately. I found a small practice downtown that specialized in family business disputes. This is ironclad, the lawyer said after reviewing the codicil. Your father was very thorough. The witnesses are still alive, the notarization is valid, and the language is clear. All we need to do is file it with the appropriate offices and notify the current board of directors. How long before it takes effect, I asked. Immediately upon filing. Your father structured this as an automatic transfer triggered by the dissolution of the original partnership. Since you've already signed documents transferring your shares to your brother, the conditions have been met. I thought about Dad's warning. Once you activate this, there's no going back. But David and Sarah had already made that choice for me, hadn't they? File it, I said. The lawyer smiled. When would you like to notify the board? I checked my watch. It was Thursday afternoon. I believe there's an emergency board meeting scheduled for Monday morning to ratify the ownership transfer. That seems like perfect timing. You want to wait until they think everything's finalized? I want to give them enough rope, I said. That weekend felt like the longest of my life. I stayed at the cabin, away from phones and email, away from the temptation to change my mind or warn anyone about what was coming. I spent the time reading through Dad's business files, understanding the full scope of what he'd built and what I was about to inherit. Morrison Construction wasn't just a successful company. It was a machine Dad had built with careful precision over 30 years. Every contract, every relationship, every system was designed to last. He'd been preparing for succession since the day David and I joined the business, but he'd also been preparing for the possibility that succession might fail. The codicil wasn't his only insurance policy. I found evidence of other safeguards, key contracts that required both Morrison brothers to approve any changes, supplier relationships that were tied to Dad's personal guarantees, even a clause in the company's insurance policies that protected against hostile takeovers. Dad had built the company to be family-owned, but he'd also built it to survive if the family fell apart. I also discovered something else in Dad's files, evidence that he'd been quietly building relationships with our key employees, particularly the foremen and project managers who kept the company running day to day. Annual bonuses that came directly from Dad's personal account, college scholarships for their kids, even personal loans during hard times. Dad hadn't just built a company, he built loyalty. And that loyalty was about to matter more than David and Sarah realized. Monday morning, I put on my best suit and drove to the office for the first time since signing those papers the week before. I parked in my old spot, the one with my name on it that nobody had bothered to change yet. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. I arrived at 8:30 and went straight to the conference room. David was already there, looking confident and relaxed. Sarah sat beside him, no longer trying to hide their relationship now that everything was supposedly out in the open. The other board members filtered in over the next few minutes. Our company lawyer, our accountant, and 3 outside directors Dad had appointed to keep things professional. "Jeff," David said when he saw me, "I didn't expect you to attend this meeting." "Wouldn't miss it for the world," I replied, taking my usual seat at the table. Sarah looked nervous. "Jeff, I hope this won't be difficult. We're all adults here." "Absolutely," I said, "all adults." I noticed that David had already moved his things into Dad's old office. Through the glass partition, I could see he'd replaced Dad's photos with his own, rearranged the furniture, even hung a new motivational poster about achieving excellence through leadership. The audacity was breathtaking. David called the meeting to order at exactly 9 o'clock. "We're here to ratify the ownership transfer document signed last Tuesday," he began, transferring Jeff Morrison's 49% ownership stake to David Morrison, giving him majority control of Morrison Construction. The company lawyer began reading through the transfer documents, explaining the legal implications, the tax consequences, the timeline for finalizing everything. David sat back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a man who'd just won the lottery. Sarah was taking notes, probably already planning her expanded role in the company. I wondered if she'd picked out new business cards yet. I let him finish. "Are there any questions or objections before we vote?" David asked. I raised my hand. "Jeff, I know this is hard, but the documents are already signed," David said with artificial sympathy. "Oh, I'm not objecting to the transfer," I said, standing up and walking to the head of the table where Dad used to sit. "I just have some additional documents to submit for the record." I placed the codicil and Dad's letter on the table in front of the lawyer. "What's this?" the lawyer asked, picking up the documents. "A codicil to Robert Morrison's will dated 6 months before his death, transferring an additional 25% of company ownership to Jeff Morrison, to be activated upon dissolution of the original partnership agreement." The room went dead silent. The lawyer studied the documents carefully. "This appears to be properly executed and notarized." "I don't understand," David said, his confident demeanor starting to crack. "It's simple," I explained calmly. Dad anticipated that the family partnership might not work out, so he created a failsafe. If the original 50-50 partnership ever dissolved, I would automatically receive controlling interest in the company. I turned to face David and Sarah directly. "When you convinced me to sign those transfer documents last Tuesday, you triggered Dad's codicil. My 49% transferred to you, David, just like we agreed. But Dad's additional 25% transferred to me at the same moment. The lawyer was doing quick math. That would make Jeff Morrison the majority shareholder with 74% ownership. Exactly, I said. Which means I have the authority to make certain immediate changes to company management. David's face had gone pale. Jeff, let's talk about this. We can work something out. We already worked something out, I replied, last Tuesday, in this same conference room. You told me the business needed clear leadership. You were right. I turned to the board. As majority owner of Morrison Construction, I am exercising my right to make the following changes, effective immediately. I pulled out a prepared statement I'd written over the weekend. David Morrison is terminated as an employee and removed from the board of directors, effective immediately. Sarah Morrison is terminated as marketing director, effective immediately. Security will escort both of them from the building within the hour. You can't do this, Sarah said, standing up. Actually, I can, I replied. I own 74% of a private company. I can do whatever I want. David finally found his voice. This isn't what Dad would have wanted. I picked up Dad's letter and read aloud. You're the one who understands what this company really is. Not just a way to make money, but a way to build something that lasts. David sees opportunity. You see responsibility. I set the letter down. Dad knew exactly what he was doing, and now, so do I. But I wasn't finished. There's something else, I said, pulling out the investigator's folder. Dad also left me this. I spread the photographs across the table. Images of David and Sarah at romantic dinners, entering hotel rooms together, sharing intimate moments at company events while I was working late or traveling to job sites. He knew about your affair for 8 months before he died. He also knew about the financial irregularities, the misused company resources, the confidential information you've been sharing with our competitors. The board members leaned forward, studying the evidence with growing shock and disgust. Dad could have confronted you then, I continued. He could have fired you both and saved everyone a lot of pain, but he chose to wait, to see if you'd come to your senses, to see if family would win out over greed and betrayal. I looked directly at David. He loved you enough to give you every chance to do the right thing. You chose not to. The meeting ended in chaos. David and Sarah threatened lawyers, lawsuits, claims of fraud and coercion. But the company attorney confirmed what I already knew. Dad's codicil was bulletproof. By noon, security had escorted them both from the building. By end of business, I'd called an all-hands meeting to explain the change in leadership to our employees. Morrison Construction was built by my father to be a family business, I told them. Today, it became one again. The response from our employees was overwhelmingly positive. Mike Rodriguez actually started applauding, and soon the entire room joined in. These were people who'd worked with me for years, who knew my character and my commitment to the company. What happens now? Asked Janet from accounting. Now we get back to what this company does best, I said. We build things that last, we treat our clients with respect, we take care of each other, and we honor the legacy my father left us. That was 6 months ago. The company is stronger now than it's ever been. Turns out, removing people who were more interested in profits than projects was exactly what we needed. We've landed 3 major contracts in the past 6 months, including the renovation of the downtown courthouse, a project David had been trying unsuccessfully to win for 2 years. Our employee retention is at an all-time high, and we've been able to give everyone their first real raises in 3 years. David found work with a competitor, though I hear he's struggling to adapt to being an employee instead of an owner. Sarah moved back to her hometown. They lasted about 3 months together after getting what they thought they wanted. I kept Dad's letter on my desk, not as a reminder of what they did to me, but as a reminder of what Dad built. Not just a company, but a legacy. The kind that survives betrayal, outlasts bad decisions, and protects the people who understand its true value. I also framed the last page of Dad's letter and hung it in the conference room where it all went down. It reads, "Success isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by what you preserve for the next generation." Sometimes people ask me if I feel guilty about what happened, if I regret destroying my relationship with my brother, ending my marriage, breaking up what was left of our family. But here's the thing they don't understand. David and Sarah destroyed those relationships long before I found Dad's letter. They just assumed there wouldn't be any consequences. Dad taught me that a man's character shows in how he handles defeat. But he also taught me that real defeat only comes when you stop fighting for what's right. I didn't defeat David and Sarah, I just let them defeat themselves. And sometimes that's justice enough. Last week, I got a letter from a young entrepreneur asking for advice about starting a family business with his brother. I invited him to the office, sat him down in the same conference room where it all happened, and shared Dad's wisdom. Build something that lasts, I told him. But more importantly, build relationships that last. Success without integrity is just expensive failure. He listened carefully, taking notes. Reminded me of myself at his age. Eager, optimistic, believing that good intentions and hard work were enough to overcome any obstacle. Maybe they are. Maybe Dad's letter was just insurance I'll never need to use again. But I keep it locked in the safe now, along with instructions for my own son when he's old enough to join the business. Because sometimes the best protection against betrayal is simply being prepared for it.